Hello, it's Stuart from Berkshire Guitar Amplifier Repairs in Reading, England, and I'm very excited about this video because this is the first of a series of videos I'm going to be sharing with you about how a guitar amplifier actually works. I'm going to assume no knowledge on your part whatsoever, so if you have a little bit of knowledge you'll have to bear with me, and I really am going to walk you through from the very beginning. I'm going to show you what a valve amplifier is. We're going to drill down to the detail of how a valve actually works, what reverb is, what tremolo is, how the power supply works, the whole business. So by the end of this short mini-series, you'll be pretty expert on your guitar amplifier. We're going to start off today by just a visual walkthrough of the top and underside of a couple of amplifiers. And I'm going to start off with a Marshall JMP, a fairly simple hand-wired amplifier without many bells and whistles on it. Then we'll have a look at something a little bit more complicated and older, a Fender Super Reverb, and that has a few more things on it that are of interest, like a reverb, vibrato, and it's a more complicated amp altogether. But of course the essentials are going to be the same. So let's kick off straight away by having a look at this Marshall JMP I have on the bench. I'll whip the chassis out of the case and we'll have a look at it topside. Well, I have the amplifier now out of the chassis, so let's take a little look along the top side and then we'll do the bottom side in a moment. So this hulking great big beast here is the power transformer, which takes the 240 volts in and produces the various voltages AC required to operate this amplifier. For example, it'll have a high tension winding giving several hundred volts, and it'll also have a low voltage winding of about 6.3 volts which operate the heaters of the valves. That's the bit that you see glowing when you look at a valve when it's on. Continuing our journey, we have a smoothing filter cap and 4 other smoothing filter caps. They help to smooth out the ripples in the AC once you've rectified it to produce DC. So it produces a nice, steady, level DC voltage. Here are our power tubes, and this amplifier, which is a 100 watt amplifier, uses 4 EL34 valves. Moving along, we have our preamplifier tubes. These are usually ECC83s or 12AX7s. They maybe don't look like valves to you, but these are just simple screens which stop the valve picking up fluorescent light, hum and that sort of thing. And they come off quite easily. You just push them down, give them a little half twist, and there's the valve underneath. Continuing on, we have a further filter capacitor. This is a choke which also smooths out AC ripples. And this second hulking beast here is the output transformer. That sits between the power valves and your loudspeaker. You obviously don't want a loudspeaker, glue all over me here, let me get that off. You obviously don't want a loudspeaker connected directly to anything in this amplifier because of course it's a touchable part and you could get a shock. So it's buffered by a transformer, and this changes the voltage, AC voltage produced by the power valves into an AC voltage suitable for driving the speaker load. And that's really it. That's all you need to know from the top side of this amp. So let's flip it over and see what it looks like underneath. Well, here we are now on the underside of the chassis, so let's just have a walk through again about what we're seeing here. Here are the input jacks. Here, of course, we have the back of all our potentiometers, which lead through to the front panel. On-off switch, standby switch, and of course indicator lamp. Over here we've got the power transformer with the leads coming in from the primary and the secondary. show you that a little bit more clearly. Zoom out a bit, there we go. Primary and secondary leads coming in, and here's our AC inlet socket, voltage selector, speaker ohmage selector, main fuse and HT fuse. You'll also notice several capacitors that look like this. There's 5 of them in this amplifier, and they're dual section as well. So this capacitor here, for example, has one capacitor between there and there and another between there and there. These are the smoothing capacitors which turn the high voltage AC into high voltage DC, which these amplifiers run off. Sometimes as much as 500 volts DC. And that of course is why you should never go poking around inside guitar amplifiers, because there are these very high voltages lying around, and they're also DC voltages, not AC, and DC is much more dangerous. I'm sure you know that, but even with the amplifier turned off and unplugged, and for some considerable time as well, these capacitors here can store a lot of charge, and many hours, even sometimes days, after you've turned off an amplifier, they can still have several hundred volts across the terminals and will give you a very nasty shock if you touch them. So we engineers always discharge these capacitors using a resistor before we start working on an amp. So let's just carry on with our little guided tour. So this amp has 4, as you know, power valves. Here is the underside of the socket base of one power valve, EL34, another one, and the final one. And over here are our preamp tubes, ECC83s. So there's the what's called the phase splitter tube, and one preamp tube, and the first preamp tube, which of course is close to the input socket. You don't really want that preamp tube at the other end of the amplifier. Having a look along the tag board, well, you'll recognize resistors and capacitors. Here are the resistors, and here are the very good quality capacitors which are in this this reissue amplifier. These are signal processing capacitors, and these are usually, well, these are electrolytic capacitors which have a much higher capacitance than these capacitors here, which is why they look a little bit different. These are the 4 diodes which do the rectification of the high voltage AC to produce our HT, or high voltage DC. And that's pretty much it for the underside of this amp. Well, that completes our simple tour of the JMP, the Marshall JMP amp. We've had a look at it top side and bottom side. Let's now compare that with a much older amp, the Fender Super Reverb. I wanted to show you 2 amplifiers because the Fender has a lot more bells and whistles than this amplifier. It has, for example, vibrato, and it has a reverb pan, and it's altogether a different amplifier inside, but of course it all has the same elements of all valve amplifiers. So let's have a look at that one now, and that will give you 2 to compare with. Let's now take a look at a different amplifier. This is the Fender Super Reverb 1960s. Lovely blackface amplifier, much sought after and worth a fair bit of money. I'll lay it down now and we'll have a look topside to see what makes this amp tick. And here we are topside, so let's have a look and see what we're looking at here. Well, the big bit of ironmongery, as always, is the mains transformer. This was originally an American Fender, and it had a 110 volt transformer in. This has been changed for a 240 volt, which is why this one looks rather new. Moving along the middle, we have here the choke, which we saw on our other amp. That does some smoothing of the AC. And here is another piece of ironmongery called the output transformer, and that sits between these 2 power valves, and your loudspeaker. I wonder what's under there. Maybe we'll have a look in a moment. So going back now and having a look at the valves, this old 1960s amplifier uses a valve rectifier. What this valve does is to rectify the AC coming out of the mains transformer secondary and turns it into DC. Nowadays we use a little 5-penny diode to do that, but the old amps didn't have good diodes, and so they used a valve to do the rectification. Here are our two output valves. These are 6V6 valves in push-pull arrangement. I'll be talking a little bit about that in another module on how the output section works. Now look at this, we have a whole slew of preamp valves compared with our previous amplifier. We had 3 on that, we've got 6 on this amplifier. But they all pretty much do the same thing. Each of these valves contains 2 stages of amplification. This is the one nearest the input jack, so the input jack signal goes to this, gets amplified up, gets passed onto this, which gets amplified up. Between here and here there is a certain amount of tone controls, more amplification. This little transformer here is the transformer that sits between this amplifier and the reverb tank. And the reverb tank sits on the bottom of the case for this amp. So this little transformer isolates the reverb tank from the amplifier. And then we have more amplification. One of these does the reverb recovery, so the signal coming back from the reverb tank is very low and needs amplifying by a stage of gain. Another of these valves, I forget which at the moment, and maybe that one, does the, or it might be that one, does the vibrato, the tremolo. We'll be talking a little bit about that on another module. And then finally, the last preamp valve in the chain is always the phase splitter. It sounds a bit technical, but it takes the sine wave input and splits it into 2 sine waves which are opposite in phase to each other to feed to the push-pull power valves. Don't worry about that at the moment, I'll be covering that in depth in another module. So that's pretty much, I was going to have a look under here, wasn't I? So I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll turn the camera off and we'll take this little cover off and see what's sitting under there. I've whipped out the screws, and what do we have under here? Ta-da! We have the smoothing capacitors, the high voltage filter or smoothing capacitors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These have been changed. In fact, I changed them for this customer. Quite often you see these brown paper things in here which always need changing. What do these capacitors do? Well, if you remember, our rectifier valve took the AC output of the mains transformer and turned it into a DC. It's not a very smooth DC, it's got quite a wobble on it. You'd hear that as very hummy if you didn't do anything about it. And so what these capacitors do is smooth out that hum to produce a nice, steady, even DC voltage. Well, let's flip the amp over and have a look bottom side and see what goes on there. Well, here we are, bottom side. Well, you could call this top side, I suppose, since the amp's now the right way up. Quick scan along the controls, although you will almost certainly know about this. Here are your input jacks. Here is the bright switch, which makes the signal a little bit higher at the higher frequencies are boosted. Volume, treble and bass for this channel. So here's a second channel here, which is called the vibrato channel, because only the vibrato and reverb work on this channel. You don't get any vibrato or reverb on that channel. Again, it's got its own bright switch, standard volume, treble, middle, bass. Here's the reverb control, which turns up the signal returned from the reverb tank. And these two are to do with the tremolo, so the intensity of the tremolo, or vibrato I should say, and the speed of the vibrato. Pilot lamp. Let's have a look on inside. And what have we got here? Here's the underside of our mains transformer. So here's the primary windings coming in here. Now the primary windings are the ones that come in from the mains, so this has 240 volts coming in from the main socket. And our secondary windings are the windings which feed the amplifier itself. Just for your interest, this has 3 sets of windings. These green ones here are 6.3 volts, which do the heaters of the valves. That's the bit that you see glowing when you see that a valve is on. I'll be covering exactly what that is in a future video. Red, blue, red, this is the HT. So it's got what's called a center tap. So it's 300 volts, 0 volts, 300 volts. And these 2 yellow wires are 5 volts AC, which feed the heater of the rectifier tube only. For some reason, I probably did know, but I've forgotten, the rectifier tube uses 5 volts for the heater, and all the other valves use 6.3 volts. So you can see these yellow wires here go to the heater of the rectifier tube, and these 2 wires here are the red ones, the HT leads. So this is high voltage AC, and this tube acts like a diode and is rectifying that to produce a high voltage DC on this brown wire, and that nips off to the smoothing capacitors that we saw under the hood on the top side. Here are our power valves. I won't bother telling you what all the individual components do, of course, like these resistors. AC cord coming in. I've disconnected that. That was something from the, I think that was a power outlet for the 110 volt American thing. This was a ground lift switch, also disconnected. Very unsafe and not needed when we convert this to UK. HT fuse and on-off and HT switches. Speaker jacks, and these are the phono or RCA connectors which go to the foot switch assembly for turning on the reverb and turning on the tremolo. So continuing along the valves, here's our phase splitter looked at from the bottom. 1 preamp valve, another one, 3 more preamp valves, and of course this is the first preamp valve, which, as you can see, goes to this bit of circuitry here, which of course comes to the input jack. So you always have the first preamp valve close to the input jack, because you don't want to be taking a very low level signal from the input jack all the way over here, across here, and having a preamp valve here or something. That would be very, very noisy. And then we have the standard Fender tag board with its capacitors. These can sometimes leak. I have tested all these, are all okay, and I like to leave in the originals because, well, people say it affects the tone. I'm not totally convinced, but anyway, I'll leave them in. These are electrolytic capacitors, and I've changed all these because the average electrolytic capacitor has a life of about 25 years, and these were 50 years old before I changed them. So I've changed those 2, I've changed those 2, I've changed those 2, and I've changed that one. There are 2 capacitors like these blue ones which normally live here and here, and I've changed those, and those are the capacitors that feed the control grids of the output tubes, and if they leak, which they do tend to, it can cause it can destroy your output tube. So I always change those 2 valves as a matter of capacitors as a matter of course. They won't affect the tone. Bias pot allows you to change the bias on the output valves. We'll be covering that as a separate subject as well. And the usual bunch of resistors and capacitors. That one's been changed that you see in a valve amplifier. These are our original carbon resistors, which are not very good compared to modern resistors. All of these resistors will be out of tolerance. They always go high. So for example, if that's a 100k resistor, that will probably measure 120 or even 150k. I don't really like to change them all out if I can. One wants to leave as much of the original as possible unless they're causing a problem, which they're not. And I think, oh no, there's something else I really want to tell you about. There's this little chappy here. This is the vibrato photo cell arrangement on these old Fender amps, and it gives a vibrato effect. It's nothing more than a LED, sorry, not an LED, a neon lamp, and a opto resistor, a photosensitive, a light sensitive resistor wrapped up in a bit of shrink wrap. And the vibrato works by flashing that neon light off and on, and that causes the resistance of this light dependent resistor to go up and down in resistance. And the faster you flash the light, the faster it goes up and down in resistance. And that's exactly the same as getting hold of a volume control. It's the same as getting hold of a volume control and doing this with it. Whoa, 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 like that. And the intensity is set by this control, and the speed of the flash of that neon is set by that control. So that's a very neat little system, isn't it? They do go wrong, and if you have an amplifier like this with low intensity vibrato, it's just a bit feeble, then all you need to do is change that cell, because the light dependent resistor, the coating on it, wears with age and it doesn't work very well. So there you go, that's a look round a really beautiful example of a blackface Fender Super Reverb amp. Okay, so there you go, walk over two amplifiers, somewhat different. One, the Marshall, a little bit more simple than the Fender. The Fender's got more valves in it, it's got reverb, it's got vibrato, it's got two channels, whereas the Marshall JMP was quite a simple single channel amplifier. But with those two amplifiers you've seen 99% of the valve amplifiers out there, and you've certainly seen every element that you're ever likely to find in a valve guitar amplifier. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and that's the end of the first part of my series on how valve guitar amplifiers work. Join me in the second part, where we'll be looking at power supplies and how all those mysterious voltages are generated in the amplifier. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.